Kelly, who joins us from Busan in South Korea. He's a political science and diplomacy professor at Pusan National University. Thanks so much for joining us here on TRT World. So clearly you are in South Korea, as I've just said. The second highest number of coronavirus cases in the world. What's it like being there now?
Well, where I live, it's okay. The center of the problems in Korea are actually in a city a little bit further north where, yeah, it really has actually started to resemble something like a movie, right? Where people are not going on the streets and the government is telling people to stay in their homes and things like that. That's in Daegu. Most of the rest of the country isn't that bad. But certainly if you go on public transportation, almost everybody's wearing a mask now of some kind, a breath mask of some kind. Public transportation is a little bit thinner. You just don't see as many people. Public events have begun to be canceled, things like concerts and races and any kind of meaningful congregation, political protests. The government's now really sort of cracking down because the spread over the weekend particularly really kind of ballooned.
And recently you wrote an article in which you say the sensationalism of the disease outbreak coverage does not help. Would you refer to this, in South Korea or, global media in general?
Both, I would suppose. I think the South Korean media has been a little bit more panicked about this than is necessary. I mean, one of the things that I always sort of throw out in the last couple of weeks as I've talked about this is that recall there are 53 million people living in South Korea, right? Citizens and foreigners together, and something like 850 of them have this disease and only 7 of them have died. I mean, this is not something like you see in the movies, right? And if you sort of turn on South Korean TV, they're now starting to show movies like that, sort of these these contagion kind of movies and stuff like that. And I'm just not sure that this is really helpful. South Korea has a very modern medical system. The likelihood that this is going to sort of explode out of control and we'll be talking about this in 6 months, I think, is pretty low. South Korea has dealt with things like this in the past pretty well. SARS, 20 years ago, the Middle East Respiratory Syndrome about 5 or 6 years ago. So I would just like to see a little bit less focus on this because it's not actually turning life here upside down. I mean, people are going to work and things like that. So I'm just a little unnerved by that. That's all. I think it's unnecessary.
But Robert, you say that, and my question to you is, do you think we actually understand the spread of this disease? Because every week we've been covering this for a long time. Right. We seem to have new information emerging and facts such as, I don't know, that you can even spread it without showing symptoms, or it lives on surfaces for 8 to 9 days. Do we understand it?
Yeah, I think that's one of the big problems, right? Is that we kind of expected this thing to go, I think, the way that previous things like bird flu have gone at that sort of peak after a while, and then sort of modern medicine would rein it in. And that's just not really happened yet, which I think is a great surprise. And I think a fair amount of that is because where this began, where this is worst in China, is an authoritarian state, which has sort of a pretty bad reputation for sharing information, right? I mean, I think that's really sort of the undiscussed political background problem in all this, right? Which is that the Chinese probably know a great deal about this, but they just don't want to tell us very much because China's really worried about its image. It's really worried about its sort of stature and stuff like that. And the Chinese have far, far more experience with this over the last few months than anybody else because China's got something like, 10,000 cases of this or more now. So to the specifics of the epidemiology of it, I won't speak to that. That's beyond my skill set. But yeah, I agree. I mean, this has turned out to be a little bit more protean, I suppose, than the last 3 or 4 of these sorts of outbreaks in the last 20 years.
Robert Kelly joining us from Busan in South Korea. Thank you so much for joining us on the News Hour.